I've never seen being a dungeon master as being all that difficult. GameMasters here, and I want to chat a bit about dungeon masters, but as a comparison between what is considered a veteran DM versus a new DM. Not in terms of age or how long one has been at it, but in terms of the overall approach to running a session or campaign and the rules that have been provided, or the lack of rules to be able to run the game. And you'll have to pardon me, my voice is a little out today. I've got a few connective points that I want to make throughout the video, and I'd like to hear from you in the comments. Feel free to pause the video at parts and leave a comment, and we can keep the discussion going. And I might go off on a tangent or two. We'll see where this goes. Hell, it may not even end up being about the complications that new dungeon masters of today see. What I won't be doing is talking about the current state of Wizards of the Coast and how players are pissed off at them about Magic the Gathering's 30th Anniversary Edition. Nor am I really going to talk about the setting content of Dragonlance that has many diehard fans up in arms. Well, not much anyway. What I've seen as of late is that newer DMs are feeling that Wizards of the Coast is not really producing the tools that they need to be able to run the game, and this confuses me a little. I look back at the resources that we had access to in the 1980s, and it's pretty much the same as it is today. Actually, we even had less. Back then, we had the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Guide, and the Monster Manual. Well, and dice, and a module or two. We didn't have a Volo's Guide to whatever, or Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, or whoever's guide to whatever. We just had the core books, a couple of adventures, and some dice. We didn't have a site like DM's Guild or Drive-Thru RPG where we could browse homebrew material. The mechanics were all listed in the DMG and in the Player's Handbook for both DMs and players. We didn't really have any more tools than that, and anything that we didn't have that we felt we wanted or needed, we just kind of created them ourselves. There wasn't really anything out there for mass combat, but we wanted something. We had a scenario of a lich that had raised an army of undead. We're talking zombies, skeletons, vampires, you name it. And the heroes had a small army that they had rallied to help take down this threat. Except there was nothing in the Dungeon Master's Guide to help guide us on how to do that. So we did it the hard way and rolled initiative for everything individually. It didn't take long for us to realize that if we did combat like that, it would take us hours to go through the entire battle. Then we decided to group up, rolling initiative for a group of, and I don't remember exactly, maybe 15 or 25 monsters to the same size group of heroes, and that seemed to work fairly well. We didn't do mass combat every game session, but when it did happen, that was the method that we used. Then for the main bad guy and the characters themselves, we'd kind of zoom in and do party versus big bad evil guy in traditional combat. We didn't throw arms up at TSR for not giving us that tool. Hell, we weren't even sure if we were even allowed to alter the rules to accommodate something like mass combat, but we went with it. We created our own stuff. And I think it's because of that experience that we really started to make D&D our own thing. Where we saw a fault, we fixed it for our group, fully recognizing that those of us that played in a different group under a different DM would simply have to deal with the rules that were specific to that group. And this was really before the term house rules came about, but it was also about the same time that I started to be the dungeon master. It was probably around 1985 or 86, and being exposed to the ability to craft my own story, I fell in love with that process. I took a lot of inspiration from movies, books, and comics, and I began to create my own world. We played in Greyhawk mostly, and when Forgotten Realms came out, I jumped all into that. And I'll admit, Forgotten Realms material, that really provided the raw stuff for me to be able to create my own homebrew world. And while Dragonlance had long been established, the lore was really based in the novels, and a lot of folks wanted to relive those novels, and they played, and that was cool, but everyone kind of really already knew what to expect. We had all read the novels as they came out, so it was kind of not fun because, well, as I said, we already knew where the adventure was going to take us. And I think that was the biggest appeal with Forgotten Realms. But to an extent, it too was easy to figure out the ending of a module because, well, players, all they had to do is simply stand there at the hobby shop and flip through it. And that's, I guess, to an extent, something that still happens today with 5th edition. So my solution was to use Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk and Dragonlance as a basis to craft my own world where my players would have no clue what was going to happen next. By the early 1990s, I think that's kind of when Dark Sun came out, and I got deeply interested in that because it took such a dark turn from the traditional fantasy setting that we'd been playing in. So I tossed heavy elements of that into my world, and when Red Steel came out, Yeah, you bet I threw elements of Vermeil into my world. Taking major play from Dragonlance, I had a massive meteor crash down upon my world, tossing chunks of Vermeil all over the place. Vermeil was a rock that could be crushed into a powder and consumed or kind of turned into a weapon, and that would slowly transform the person into a monster. And it was because of this that I found that we needed more rules for something that didn't exist. My players wanted to play as monsters. All we had were the stats from the monster manual. I had not even thought about yet about making my own monsters. It just never occurred to me. Not until they wanted to play as monsters. Then we dug deep into how to make that happen, and it was actually super easy. We just converted some stats over, and keep in mind, back then, monsters didn't have stat listings like strength, dexterity, intelligence, and the like. It was shortly after that that I discovered TSR's Top Secret. And this was a game setting that was totally different from Dungeons & Dragons. Instead of warriors and wizards, you were a secret agent. Now, if I remember correctly, it used only a 10-sided die, and the character sheets were called agent dossiers. And while some of the elements were similar, like strength became physical strength, charisma became charm, wisdom and intelligence were lumped together into a stat called knowledge, it was different enough for me to get inspired to try to pull my players from the fantasy world and kind of into a modern era, but still using their D&D characters. Again, there were no rules for that. And I discussed my plan with the guy that ran the game store. He told me about Call of Cthulhu and Ravenloft, and that introduced yet another element to my world: horror. The next thing I knew, I had more supplements than I knew what to do with, but wow, man, did it ever expand my homebrew world. What was ultimately cool about this was that my players could literally have any kind of gaming session that they wanted, from high fantasy to darkened horror, from a hybrid of modern to playing monsters. And I guarantee you, you will never find a Dungeons & Dragons book that covers all of that for any Dungeon Master. And I'm not slamming anyone. I'm not poking fun at any new Dungeon Master by what I'm about to say, because I was there at the beginning of my D&D career. I was the one that was looking for guidance, for rules, for structure. And it just didn't occur to me that it was really up to me and my friends to create and craft up what we wanted, and it was perfectly a-okay to do that. Fast forward to Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition and 4th edition. Feats were added, then kind of watered down. The D20 system was introduced. THAC0 was removed. Modifiers were added and changed and removed and added again. Multiclassing became a big deal. Subclasses were introduced. Monsters had this thing called Bloodied, which I always loved. And then 5th edition came along and changed a lot of those elements, even adding advantage and disadvantage, which I'd never really liked. I kind of just simply prefer the mechanic of what is rolled. And, but here's the thing. Just because I like or dislike something doesn't mean that other DMs have to accept it either way. What it does mean is that when I establish my own table rules to the people playing, if they want to play at my table, they do have to accept those changes. I'm not trying to railroad the players. I'm not trying to force them to play a game that they don't want to play. I explain up front in session 0, while everyone is creating their characters, that there are aspects of D&D that I absolutely love, and there are aspects of the game that I refuse to use, and I'll do my best to address those aspects again in session 0. I also go out of my way to let new players know that the game itself, the story, is all about them. That the tweaks to the rules that I've made are done not because I want to limit them in their characters' abilities, but rather it's because I know the world that I've built, and it helps me to craft up the road that they will ultimately choose to follow. I sometimes get the impression from listening to newer DMs that they're hesitant to alter the rules or aspects of what is written on the page. Dungeons & Dragons is not a complex system. It's really not a difficult thing to run. I guess how I see it is that Dungeons & Dragons, to me, really hasn't changed that much since the 1980s, at least not on a fundamental level. Obviously, it's grown in popularity. It's really no longer seen as a game played by rejects and outcasts. It's most certainly become mainstream. Yes, I've seen the videos, I've read the Reddits that are out there with people up in arms about Spelljammer not having space combat rules. I've seen the same comments being made about Dragonlance and its lack of mass combat rules, and for me those are non-issues because me and my group made up those rules a long time ago. Now what I will grant is the frustration that one is most certainly going to have when there are not actual official rules and you go to play with one group that has their own homebrew rules, then move to a new group that uses a different set of homebrew rules. I totally get the frustration in that, and I fully understand that that form of play is not appealing for anyone. I think it puts me in a unique position as being a dungeon master, but I will say this. In my 35 years or so of playing, I've never once had a brawl. I've never seen player A get pissed off at player B or player C just ups and quits because of a bad roll. I've read about it, but I've never experienced it myself. Maybe I've been lucky, and I've certainly seen my fair share of players. So this has to tell me that I'm doing something right. Yeah, we've had some players leave because they got married or moved away, or in a few instances pass away, but never have I ever had anyone just get flat out nasty and hateful. I've been told that what I'm running isn't actually Dungeons & Dragons, but in my heart it is. I'm using a combination of rules and mechanics that work for me and my table. I've not had any complaints. That said, there is the analogy of, well, if you get a car and it breaks down and you start replacing parts, at what point is it no longer the same car? I get the sentiment. But to me, Dungeons & Dragons has always been about making it your own and crafting up what you need that isn't actually there. If there is any takeaway at all from this, it's this. As a dungeon master, you are 100% free and clear to make any rule you need. That's even one of the first things that the Dungeon Master's Guide will tell you. Even going all the way back to the previous editions of the game, there will always be rules lawyers that will try to tell you otherwise. But at the end of the day, it is your task to keep the story flowing and to keep the interest and fun running. No one wants to be in the middle of a battle and stop to scan through 3 books to see exactly where the jump mechanic is for someone playing a Herringen, and then cross-reference that with the druid that just casts jump on the same Herringen. In other words, sometimes you have to just let some things happen for sake of, holy shit, that was wicked cool. Did you see how far she jumped? The second takeaway should also be this. My way is not the only way to play. I've honed my methods over a span of 30 plus years. I've incorporated elements of different settings. Hell, I've even taken plot points from popular culture, like Westworld, and have twisted them into my campaigns. In one of my settings that uses Spelljammer, much of how things work there is a heavy fantasy spin on the classic Star Trek tropes. But as I mentioned, my way is not the only way, but it does work for me and my players. As a dungeon master, you too will find what works best for you and your group, and you may very well need to change your style of running from one group to the next, depending on several factors, from the race and class that the players are playing to the overall storyline and genre of the adventure, be it horror or pure fantasy. As a DM, you need to be as flexible as you are willing to be, and remember that it is the players and their characters that are crafting the story itself. You are simply there to help them navigate the lands and describe what that creature over on the cliff up there is actually doing. Dungeons & Dragons is an immensely fun game. Computer and console role-playing games can be fun, but they're too limiting. Too many times have I played a game only to find that I can't sit down on a chair. I can't climb up a tree to get a better look around. I can't even do a simple task like swim. In D&D, however, it's whatever your imagination will allow. And if there are no rules for it, create them. I cannot stress that enough. That's the best mechanic of all. You can create whatever you need. Now, I certainly hope that some of you have paused the video along the way and have left some comments down below. I'm going to do my best to respond to each one, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask. I can't promise that I'll know every answer, but I know that we've got a fantastic group here that watches, and I know someone's going to be able to answer your question, or at the very least give a different perspective on what I've presented here. Back in September, I did a video on how to unlock Dungeon Master Easy Mode, and you can check that video out here. It's a fair bit shorter than this one, only about 2 minutes or so, but trust me, it really will make DMing much easier for you. As mentioned, talk to me down in the comments. Let's have a grand conversation, and until next our paths cross, may you find or create the rules that you're looking for.